Hello everybody and welcome back to another Future of the Fortress read-along. In this video I will be reading the Future of the Fortress posts by Tarn Adams. The Future of the Fortress is a Q&A that happens monthly on the Bay 12 forums about all things DF. If you would like to get in there and get some questions answered yourself, you can join the forum and find the thread. Link is down in the description. So obviously this entire video is going to be a lot of me reading things, so just kind of keep that in mind. Before we dive in though, I do have this other interesting thing. Kitfox Games is hiring for somebody to work on adventure mode. Now, I will spare you all the details. I'll kind of show the hiring application form on screen and what they require. There's also a link down in the description to where you can see this yourself, read it in detail, and then maybe send them an email if you so qualify. Keep this in mind that this really kind of says as to how far along adventure mode is for some of you who keep asking me. Adventure mode is a ways off. They are currently hiring somebody to work on it alongside of them to help with audio design and audio engineering. So that's where things are at. We're a ways off. So pump the brakes, hold your horses, and don't get too excited because it's going to be a time is subjective situation again for quite some time. Now diving into the Bay 12 blog post by Toady, and he says, a monthly report and a Q&A reply to start the month. A month where circumstances have calmed down a bit, so I should actually have some things to post here as we enter the land of patches once more. Mission status. Threeto writes, circumstances have called for a new paradigm. A new procedurally generated fantasy order, if you will, due to the mass of paying customers pressing responsibility into this situation. We will have to adapt. Streamlining, bug fixing, UI, and ease of use were once thought of as a hindrance, and they are now first and foremost of the essence. But what about the future? The promises? Who said we can't do two things at once? Now we have a posse. Adventure awaits, but we will always respect those that await adventure. Congratulations to the generous Threeto. Tarn returns with his monthly fun with numbers, and he says, March went very well. There was a documentary filming GDC and PAX East and the spring sale for February, to which our April 3rd check corresponds. We brought in just under $300,000, which is fantastic, and at the same time indicative to how fast things drop off. With all that was going on, as expected, I hardly got the chance to do any work on the game itself. In April, the goal is to shift away from broader issues and just focus back in on the game so that we can start patching properly again. Putnam and the artists have already teed me up with a bunch of stuff, and we're aiming to get the public experimental branch up with SDL2 this month. And Zach and I are engaging more seriously with the adventure mode planning since we'll be diving into that after some patches have landed. The first question comes in from Immortal D, and they say, what news of new music and graphics for premium? Are friendly necromancer experiments supposed to be so common? I rarely see them invade, but a whole bunch of them show up at every fort as scholars and visitors. The caverns still regularly see multiple hundreds of invaders pile up, regardless of caps. Is this strictly a difficulty setting, or something that needs further adjustment? Is the lack of caravans from your home civ after becoming the mountain home intentional? And Tarn's response, for graphics, we had some news about, example, baby animals since this was announced, but I think we've announced everything that's ready to go. And yeah, right now civs aren't particularly xenophobic about it, even when their cultures would bend that way. So the friendly populations probably win out until the inevitable necromancer death of the universe. If the world gen runs too long, I don't recall if the hostile experiment populations successfully replenish on their own currently either. Necromancers don't mass produce them after world gen, which is an issue with sustainability. And in regards to caverns, they're still just broken and need to be patched, and the wagons not showing up with the mountain homes might have been intentional a zillion years ago, but now they say it makes no sense. The next question comes in from Frankville, and they say, no doubt Steam graphics will be reused in adventure mode, but is there still much to be done in the graphics section for this mode by artists? And in the sound section, can we finally enjoy a soundtrack in adventure mode? And Tarn's response is, yeah, there are several things to do, and some of them aren't even decided. in the we definitely need it category. We have done the mid-level maps and towns, etc., and stuff like combat and movement indicators that we don't need in fort mode, and in the we'll see how this plays out category, we have stuff like conversation and wrestling and inventory interfaces, and animal people adventurers may need some attention. We're currently giving some attention to above ground plants, which are much more visible in adventure mode. But this will also impact above ground fort farms, of course. And adventure mode is going to need a whole RPG style soundscape. We're seeking an audio engineer, for example, for this reason. Music is also a current discussion, and it could be pretty exciting overall. We'll see what comes back to fort mode as well, since the sounds, not music, got the short end of the stick there. The next question comes in from Stoyang, who says, I'm curious about the overall development of Dwarf Fortress. You on occasion mention upgrading the compiler using Visual Studio 20XX and the like. As a programmer, I wanted to ask, what automated tools do you have to help you keep the code healthy and stop bugs before they begin? Examples being Clang, Tidy, G-Test, or GSL from Microsoft. I don't know what anything that he's talking about is, but I will continue to read. On the vein, have you updated any parts of the code recently to use more modern patterns from C++, 11, 14, 17, 20? I know that this is a relatively large project, and I started long ago, so I imagine that there are things like unique, PTR, and optional are not heavily used. Putnam has done some things now, yeah, and I was required to update to the latest Enterprise MSVC since the game did well. So I'm all up to date with handy tools, and I've done some static analysis, etc., though there are false positives and sometimes it dies, so it can be troublesome. I don't know the modern patterns myself, so I'm not updating them. I think Auto was the last thing I started using for convenience, and maybe that was C++ 11 or something. The next question from friend of the show, Volleylol, and they say, with the baby update either already being out by the time this is answered or coming soon, are there any plans to go into the raws and give some creatures the child and token stages? Or is there some thematic meaning behind certain creatures being locked out of domestication due to them being born as adults? The giant variants of animals, which should metamorphose as understandable since it presumably take a bloody rewrite to get the proper giant cave tadpoles and giant flea tadpoles. But is there an argument for dragons too, since they are the ultimate beast of sorts? But Crundles are less obvious. And Tarn's response is, I was surprised that a few of the ones that didn't have a child tag when I was going through, and I'm sure some of it just depends on their copy-paste parent, on what their copy-paste parent was way back when they were created. Since children were basically irrelevant back then and they didn't come up. I don't know if any will be changed in the upcoming update, though, since I'm just going to go with the art I've received. These assignments were entirely based on existing tags, though I possibly missed or added some by accident. And the next question comes in from Black Aeon, and they say, I'm not sure this has ever been brought up, but with the Myth and Magic release coming soon-ish, time is subjective, will Gods and Magic system allow for more varied and developed complex mega beasts? Better yet, will we get some sentient races of mega beasts and or primordial godlike beings that wander the world and create vague civilizations of their own? Also, will all beings created by the gods look the same from world to world, or will they look different? And then Tarn responds to a few different replies where people talk about various pie-in-the-sky features, and then Tarn responds with, to add to the replies, there's also the concept of the constrained dragon generator I've mentioned from time to time that applies to things like elves too, where there are lots of concepts that get mixed up, producing something elf-like or given a setting. And there's an editor for style constraints and the myth-imposed constraints. Once we have frameworks like that in place, we should be in a good position. We want to be able to build up raw definitions in various ways with various stakeholders, and in the outcome, this seems possible. anyway. Another question from Black Aeon, and they say, sorry for multiple questions, but will we be able to make larger worlds? Like, as in worlds so large they dwarf Earth, since that has happened a few times in fiction, albeit rarely. Hunter x Hunter and Toriko specifically had worlds so ridiculously big that areas in which humans and other sentients lived in and amounted to a few small islands in the middle of a lake. Not an inland ocean, but a lake. Hold on a second. I think that's a spoiler for at least one of those series. Sorry. And Tarn's response is, yeah, there are technical issues, and some parts of the game are slower from pathfinding to save and load from since the raw size of them. The map rewrite should give us some concepts of infinite worlds, but there's a trade-off since the information can't all be stored. It doesn't solve pathing on its own, and nothing gets around the fundamental problems of procedural emptiness and the repetition, except for hard work of adding variety. And a kind of statement / question comes in from Kontako, and they say, this may be an unnecessary throwback to a now defunct mechanic, but I may have misinterpreted what was said, as tends to happen. But I've been listening to old DF Talk recordings, and in DF Talk 4 you mentioned that when placing civilizations you begin with 20 individuals to assure genetic diversity and also limit incestuous couplings. Does this mean that family trees of all non-historical individuals is tracked through world generation, and a family tree could theoretically be drawn from a descendant between a descendant and two of the founding 20? It was always an assumption of mine that population numbers and growths was simulated through some sort of equation. This is the part that I'm interested in, really. At the risk of having asked too many questions, what determines what genes an individual can have? Is there a single gene pool available for members of a civilization, or how many? Or are gene pools more granular and differ based on site and other entities? And Tarn's response is, does DF Talk 4 predate the addition of entity populations? Non-historical individuals just have the population pool information. Genetic information is stored in units for their historical figures at the end of world generation. Before that, I'm pretty sure it's still tracked. Yeah, world gen genetic structure in the historical figure that is used during world gen and then passed over to anybody that survives to their unit definition. So, theoretically, family lines and characteristics, etc., are fully tracked once somebody becomes historical through whatever deterioration that's undergone over the years. I'm sure it's still a thing. The next question comes in from Dick Butt and they say, in the event that this feature isn't intentional, can we keep it? Evidently, when an artifact is either created or named out in the rain, even if the precipitation happens to be some kind of freakish weather, the artifact is liable to be permanently covered in whatever it reagents or pre-artifact item was coated in. Really? So an artifact can be permanently coated in water? That's crazy. And Tarn's response is, my understanding is that the description is being pulled off on the fly from the item linked to the artifact, which is maintained in the memory to avoid Nemesis unit load failure type messages. Oh, I remember that bug. So if the item becomes uncoated with dwarf blood by being washed, for example, I think it would then state instead that the item is coated with water in Legends until it dries off. Science is welcome, of course. Time to start dousing your artifacts in goo, everybody. The next question comes in from Shaunai Dweller, and they say, if, as an adventurer, I manage to become a notorious villain with a wide crime network, will the game be robust enough for me to retire and try to hunt down myself with a new character? Will the clues that should lead to me, the villain I made, exist? And Tarn's response is, for the first question, yeah, this will almost certainly be the case. In general sense of your old character being an ongoing villain that needs hunting. All of the data structures information will be the same, and it'll be set up for the AI to just take over, and all of your subordinates will already be using this code while you are still playing. Presumably even producing clues that can be stupidly and ironically follow to hunt yourself. That's the hope and intention and design anyway, and I don't see a reason why it wouldn't work, though I am sure that there will be hiccups that will arise. One I can think of is knowing overall intent of your character. The game will act out their existing plots and relationships once you retire, but knowing broadly where they went, where they want thing to go needs some more info. This is a general issue with retirement overall, and I think that we've mentioned before, we haven't done anything with it aside from adding personalities and values to character gen, not char gen. For the second question, I can't say yet. I'm not sure that how the system is going to work on a granular level. Certainly, any of your new plots, your adventure hatches will fall under the investigation system that exists, but it may be trickier to find clues for existing plots. Although each of the sub-actors that continues operating will likely generate them as they advance the existing plots step by step, but getting that first lead may be different for retired player villains, and it may take some time to find it, but that's my intuition anyway. The next quote from Eurus Mixadis, and they say, after the Magic update, will there be the possibility of superhero-style worlds where each caster has unique powers? It's probably already possible with mods, but I digress. Tarn quotes Patrick Lundell, so I will read their post first, and they say, I don't see that as being an intentional world variant, but if you had a world where magic ability was very rare, but very powerful, and magic couldn't be taught, but I bet it had to be developed by each individual based on more or less random traits, you might find the possibility of come to somewhat near such a world. And Tarn's response is, yeah, as Patrick suggests, I think the bloodline of one extreme would get you there. Or maybe the corruption mechanics as well, which would be released to a blessing-style system which is virtually the same as the current necromancer system. And it just needs a reason to generate a unique thing, and it do it. And it needs to understand that if children are affected, you might want a 100% wobble on that to make those unique too, or less to make them related to powers, which just takes us back to typical bloodline scenario. Seems feasible, and there are some practical limits on the number of simultaneous systems, but the power definitions are pretty lightweight. So overall, I feel like we'd start within range, and then subsequent changes in mods and editor profiles would land you around where you want to be. Next question comes in from Bieg, and they say, what do you think will be the hardest part of adventure mode to port to the Steam release? Antaran says, conversations in wrestling need updates, and that'll take some UI work. Handling Z-level display will be interesting since we're considering situations where you might see up hillsides, for instance, and that could get a little weird sometimes when subterranean spaces or interiors compete. But the trickiest part will probably be balancing the amount of new additions and tweaks, etc. we feel are necessary for the mode to be in a good state without sucking in all the villains and army stuff. And the final question from Oster, and they say, are there any plans for fixing and improving the ASCII UI? Right now it looks like the graphical UI copied one-to-one, which doesn't really work. For example, the magnifying glass icon on the workshop makes zero sense, since in ASCII, a simple D for details would work 100 times better, and the list goes on and on. And Tarn's final response to the Q&A is, D doesn't necessarily mean anything obvious either, really, at first encounter, and also maybe implies a hotkey. It's all down to tooltips in the end, and if we have little square buttons in ASCII, which we are stuck with for now, and which are always pretty bad, ultimately we may be able to decouple the one-to-one matchup a bit. But that won't be possible if I can't maintain it. And that brings us to the end of this month's Future of the Fortress. If you enjoyed this episode, which was a little bit shorter, do check out my Twitch streams because you get to hear more of my voice. And of course, as always, if you would like to take part in these conversations, there is a link down in the description of this video to the posts, all related, as well as that job application form. If you enjoy the content I put out, definitely check out my Patreon and maybe look into my merch store, as YouTube has been trying to make it tricky for me to monetize my videos lately. Things have gotten a little smoother, but are still not the best. So I just wanted to say thank you to everybody who supports this channel and myself directly, and I hope to see you in the next one.